April 1945. Allied forces are tearing through Germany. The war is almost over, and a 24-year-old American lieutenant named David Silberberg is driving down a country road outside a town called Degennershausen when he notices a wrecked truck in a ditch. Papers are scattered everywhere across the road. He picks one up. It's signed by Joachim von Ribbentrop, Hitler's foreign minister. Within weeks, Allied troops will recover 400 tons of Nazi diplomatic correspondence. 400 tons. Inside that mountain of paper, 60 documents will reveal something so explosive that the British government will spend the next 70 years trying to bury it. Because one of the men named in those files had once been King of England. Not a minor aristocrat. Not a distant cousin. The King. And what those documents describe isn't rumour, isn't gossip, and isn't speculation. It is the documented, archived, declassified record of a royal betrayal. If this is your first time on this channel, hit that like button right now and subscribe to Jenny Exposes, because this is exactly the kind of story the mainstream media still dances around, and we do not dance here. Every single claim in what you're about to hear is sourced, verified, and sitting in the National Archives at Kew. Let's get into it. To understand why those 60 documents matter so much, you need to understand who Edward VIII actually was before he became the man history tried to quietly forget. Because the official version, the romantic, cinematic, "oh, he gave up the throne for love" version, is one of the most successfully maintained public relations myths of the 20th century. And the truth, the fully documented truth, is considerably darker. Edward, Prince of Wales, was born in 1894. By the time he reached adulthood, he was the most celebrated royal in the world. Genuinely charismatic, fashionable. He toured the empire, shook hands with working men, and cultivated an image as a modern, reform-minded prince who understood ordinary people in a way the stiff Victorian court never had. The public adored him. The press worshipped him. When his father, George V, died in January 1936 and Edward became king, there was genuine national excitement. Here, finally, was a monarch for the 20th century. What the public didn't know, and what the establishment absolutely did know, was the other Edward, the private one. The one who had been raised speaking German. The one whose family had only changed their surname from Saxe-Coburg-Gotha to Windsor in 1917, because the anti-German feeling during the First World War had become so intense that even the royal family couldn't ignore it. Edward kept deep personal ties to his German cousins throughout his adult life. And from the late 1920s onwards, he became increasingly open in his admiration for the political movements rising across continental Europe. Not cautiously, not privately, openly. Officials within the Foreign Office were logging their concerns about his views as early as the 1930s. His own private secretary, Alan Lascelles, described him as not quite sane, and wrote frankly in his private diaries about the danger Edward posed to constitutional government. This is not hindsight. These concerns were being raised in real time by the people closest to him, years before the abdication. And then there's the question of state papers. Senior ministers discovered that Edward was leaving red boxes, boxes containing some of the most sensitive, confidential government documents in Britain, lying around carelessly at Fort Belvedere, his country house, where guests moved freely. Some of those guests were known to have sympathies that made experienced Foreign Office hands extremely nervous. There were serious, documented concerns that classified material was being seen by people who had absolutely no business seeing it. When you understand all of that, the abdication crisis of December 1936 looks rather different. Yes, Wallis Simpson was the public pretext, but for significant sections of the British establishment, she was also an extremely convenient one. December the 10th, 1936. Edward signs the instrument of abdication. He addresses the nation on the BBC and says the most famous words of any royal broadcast in history, that he has found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and discharge his duties as king without the help and support of the woman he loves. The country wept. The world marvelled at the romance of it. and the men who had been quietly terrified of what another year of Edward on the throne might mean, quietly exhaled. He married Wallis Simpson in France in June 1937. They were given the title the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. Wallis was explicitly denied the title Her Royal Highness, a deliberate, calculated snub that she never forgave and that Edward never stopped resenting. And then, 4 months later, in October 1937, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor did something that would follow them for the rest of their lives. They accepted an invitation to tour Nazi Germany as the personal guests of Adolf Hitler. The trip was arranged by and paid for by the Nazi government. The official stated purpose was that Edward wanted to study German housing and labour conditions. The actual purpose, from the Nazi side, was propaganda, and they got it in abundance. The photographs from that tour are public record. Edward giving a Nazi salute at various official functions. Edward shaking hands with senior party officials. Edward and Wallis being received with all the ceremony of a state visit, while actual reigning monarchs across Europe were quietly appalled. And at the end of the trip, Edward sat with Adolf Hitler himself at the Berghof retreat in Bavaria. Afterwards, Edward wrote Hitler a thank you letter, in German. It survives. The relevant passage, translated, reads, "Many thanks to you for the wonderful time that we had with you at the Obersalzberg." Hitler, for his part, reportedly told Ribbentrop afterwards that Wallis would have made a good queen. That is not propaganda. That is the documented record of what was said and written by the man who had been King of England 11 months earlier. So here is where the story moves from disturbing to genuinely dangerous. May 1939. Europe is on the knife edge. Hitler has already seized Austria and Czechoslovakia. British rearmament is accelerating. War is weeks away from being inevitable. And the Duke of Windsor, operating from his exile in France, records a radio address. The content of that address is a direct call for Britain to seek peace terms with Nazi Germany. He sends it to American networks. The BBC refuses to broadcast it. The tape is filed in the BBC's own archive with a card attached. That card reads, "Important, not to be broadcast." That tape exists. The BBC's archive confirms it. The man who had been King of England, who had been briefed on state secrets, who had sat in on cabinet-level discussions, who knew more about British military preparedness than almost any private citizen alive, was, weeks before Hitler invaded Poland, using his platform to argue that Britain should stand down. Now we reach the summer of 1940. France has fallen. The German army is at the Channel. Britain is alone, and the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, who had been living in Paris, are fleeing south through a collapsing country. They move through Spain into Portugal, where they settle at a villa in Cascais, outside Lisbon. And here is where the Marburg Files begin in earnest. The Marburg Files are Nazi Foreign Ministry telegrams. They were captured by Allied forces in 1945. They were eventually declassified and are now held at the National Archives in Kew. They document in real time, in the words of German diplomats and officials, what happened in Portugal in the summer of 1940. And what they document is this. Joachim von Ribbentrop, on Hitler's direct authority, ordered Nazi diplomatic assets in Spain and Portugal to make contact with the Windsors. The plan had a name, Operation Willi, and it had a goal. The goal was to prevent Edward from leaving Europe, to keep him accessible, to either use him as a hostage to force British surrender terms, or, if the expected German invasion of Britain succeeded, to reinstate him as a puppet king of a defeated nation. Let that land for a moment. The German Foreign Ministry's official plan was to put Edward back on the throne of a conquered Britain. And the telegrams document the responses from those who spoke to the Windsors. The German ambassador in Madrid reported that Edward had expressed the view that Britain's continued resistance was pointless and that further bombing would force the country to capitulate. A separate telegram records the reaction of the Windsors when the possibility of returning to the throne was raised. The exact language used by the German diplomat about Wallis is one of the most chilling lines in the entire archive. It reads that the Duchess, in particular, became very thoughtful. Not outraged, not dismissive, thoughtful. Now, this is the point where good historical practice requires stating what the files do and do not prove. They prove that the Nazi government wanted to use Edward. They prove that German officials believed Edward was willing to be used, or at minimum, that he was not hostile to the idea. They prove that conversations took place. What they cannot conclusively prove, because we only have one side of those conversations, is the precise degree of Edward's active cooperation versus passive sympathy. That distinction matters. But here is what is equally true and equally documented. Edward did not immediately leave for Britain. He did not report these approaches to the British government. He stayed at the villa of Ricardo Espírito Santo, a Portuguese banker with thoroughly documented ties to German intelligence. He delayed and delayed and delayed. Which brings us to Winston Churchill. Churchill had been Edward's friend. He had supported him during the Abdication crisis, to the frustration of many in the Conservative Party. But Churchill was now Prime Minister. And Churchill was not a man who allowed sentiment to override national survival. He sent the Duke a direct telegram. He was to take up the post of Governor of the Bahamas. A posting so deliberately remote, it might as well have been the moon, immediately. And the telegram made clear that failure to comply would result in Edward being called before a military court-martial. Edward held an honorary rank of Major General. Churchill was prepared to use it. Even then, Edward did not leave immediately. He was delayed for nearly a month. The Marburg Files record that German agents, in a final attempt to keep him in Europe, arranged a fake bomb threat against the ship the Windsors were due to depart on, hoping the security scare would give Edward a pretext to remain. It didn't work. In August 1940, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor sailed for the Bahamas, and Edward spent the rest of the Second World War governing a small island chain in the Caribbean, thousands of miles from any theatre of significance. His public statements from that period, several of which survive, are described by British historians in terms ranging from unhelpful to borderline defeatist. He spent 4 years in Nassau, throwing parties, complaining about the posting, and waiting for a war he privately seemed to believe Britain would lose. He was wrong, of course. Britain didn't lose. And when the war ended and Allied troops opened those filing cabinets in Degeneshausen, the documents that fell out created an immediate and serious problem for the British government. Because by 1945, the Windsor file, the 60-odd documents specifically relating to Operation Willi and the Duke of Windsor's conduct in Portugal, was not just an embarrassment. It was potentially a constitutional catastrophe. The wartime king, George VI, Edward's younger brother, the man who had taken the throne Edward vacated and carried it through the most devastating war in human history, was still on the throne. The monarchy had emerged from the war with its reputation enhanced, partly because of George VI's refusal to leave London during the Blitz. And now, sitting in American custody, was documented evidence that his brother had been the target of a Nazi plot to restore him to power, a plot he had not reported, not fled from, and not publicly denounced. Churchill, by then out of office, and King George VI began intensive diplomatic lobbying of Washington to suppress the Windsor Files specifically. The Americans, to their credit, pushed back. Historians on the joint Allied editorial team that was preparing Documents on German Foreign Policy for official publication, the series that would eventually become a public HMSO release, objected to selective censorship of the archive. Eisenhower's correspondence on the matter has been declassified. It confirms that there was American discomfort with the British request. The compromise reached was a staged release. Partial disclosure in 1954, fuller released in 1957. The most sensitive material continued to trickle out over subsequent decades, with the last of the relevant files not moving to the Public Record Office at Kew until the 1990s. The cover-up itself is documented. That is the detail that deserves to be said again plainly. This is not a conspiracy theory. The effort to suppress these files is part of the official diplomatic record. The reasons for suppression were stated openly in correspondence between heads of government. The justification given was that releasing the Windsor documents would damage the monarchy at a moment of post-war fragility. That justification is on paper, in archives, available to anyone who wants to go and read it. What did the royal family itself do? George VI, as noted, had spent most of the war barely speaking to his brother. The relationship between the two men had curdled long before the Marburg Files came to light. Edward had a way of making enemies even of those who started out as his defenders. Queen Elizabeth II, when she came to the throne in 1952, permitted Edward limited contact. He attended her coronation, they met occasionally, but never restored him fully to the family. The title business, the question of Wallace's status, the accumulated resentments of the abdication and everything that followed it, none of it was ever resolved. Edward died in Paris on the 28th of May, 1972. Wallace died in April, 1986. They are buried together at Frogmore on the Windsor estate. In death, they got the royal ground that was denied to them in life. No reigning British monarch has ever publicly addressed the Marburg Files. Not George VI, who was on the throne when they were first released. Not Elizabeth II, under whose reign the bulk of the material became public. Not Charles III. The institutional silence has been total, consistent, and, in its own way, as revealing as anything in the archive itself. When the 2022 BBC documentary Edward VIII, Britain's Traitor King was broadcast, it drew on recently uncovered material to argue that the picture painted by the official documents alone actually understates how serious the situation was. That documentary ran on the BBC in 2022, 82 years after Operation Willi. And still, silence from the palace. There are people who will tell you the Marburg Files have been misread. That Edward was a naive man being manipulated by his wife and by German contacts who told him what he wanted to hear. That he was vain and foolish and deeply unfit for the throne, but not actually treasonous. That the word thoughtful in a German diplomatic telegram is being asked to carry too much evidential weight. These are legitimate historiographical arguments, and they deserve to be acknowledged. The historical record is genuinely contested at the margins. But here is what is not contested. A former British king, holding honorary military rank, in contact with agents of a foreign power that was actively at war with Britain, on the territory of a neutral country, did not report those contacts to the British government. He did not leave immediately when ordered to. He stayed, for weeks, at the home of a man with documented links to German intelligence. German diplomatic telegrams record that officials believed he was potentially open to returning to Europe under German auspices. And the British and American governments reached a joint agreement to delay publication of the documents that contained all of this information. That sequence of facts is not an interpretation. It is the record. And the question that the Marburg Files have always posed, the question that no institution has ever publicly answered, is this. What does it mean for the idea of hereditary monarchy that the man who was King of England in 1936, who had sat in on cabinet briefings and read state papers and been told the most sensitive secrets of British government, had sympathies that made him, in the summer of 1940, either a willing or a passive participant in a Nazi plan to put him back on the throne of a defeated nation? What does it mean that the government's response was not accountability, but concealment? That the priority was not truth, but the preservation of the institution? Because the institution is the key. Nobody was protecting Edward by the 1950s. Nobody in the establishment particularly liked him. He had burned nearly every bridge he had. The thing being protected was the crown itself. The idea that hereditary monarchy is a legitimate and stable form of governance. That the people who occupy it are worthy of the deference and the funding and the constitutional authority they receive. That idea becomes considerably harder to sustain when you have 60 Nazi diplomatic telegrams sitting in an archive at Kew. The Marburg Files were captured in April 1945. They are now 80 years old. The last British monarch who knew Edward personally died in 2022. We are now at sufficient historical distance that the story can be told plainly, without the cover of sentiment or institutional fragility. It is being told in documentaries. It is being written about in peer-reviewed history. The documents are publicly available. And yet, the official position of the British monarchy, the institution whose founder was named in those telegrams, remains one of complete and total silence. That silence tells you something. It tells you that even now, 8 decades on, the palace calculates that acknowledging what Edward did is more dangerous than continuing to ignore it. That the question the Marburg Files raise about hereditary legitimacy is still too uncomfortable to answer publicly. That 400 tons of paper, 60 documents, and 1 former king still represent a threat that the most powerful family in Britain has chosen, generation after generation, to handle by saying absolutely nothing at all. David Silberberg picked up that document in a German ditch in April 1945. He had no idea what he was holding. He had no idea that the paper in his hands would eventually survive 3/4 of a century of institutional pressure to make it disappear. That it would be argued over by historians on 2 continents. That it would be withheld from the public by 2 governments acting in concert, and that it would still be sitting in an archive in West London, unacknowledged by the family it most directly concerns, in the year 2024. 400 tons of paper, 60 documents, 1 former king, and a silence that has now lasted almost a century. If you made it this far, you already know this channel does not cut corners. Every claim you just heard is sourced, archived, and publicly available. Subscribe to Jenny Exposes, share this video with someone who thinks the royal family is above scrutiny, and I will see you in the next one.